My name is Jose, and able to hear the sound of my voice. I want to welcome you all to another weekly walk. So I want to welcome you folks back from the Thanksgiving holiday. So I hope you all had the chance to rest and perhaps spend some time with family, friends, and loved ones. Today, we're going to dive deep into New York City history, and we're going to celebrate a little-known holiday known as Evacuation Day. So Evacuation Day is a celebration that honors New York City's role during the Revolutionary War. So our walk will be all about Central Park's role during this very pivotal moment in American history. Okay, and hopefully, there we go. So hopefully you folks should be able, here we go. So now I have actually just appeared on the screen. So welcome, welcome, hello. Let's go ahead and actually move on with our walk and see what we have going on for today. And of course, before we start off, let's go over the controls on Zoom real quick. Now, all participants are muted, but you can use the chat feature to say hello and comment. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. And my colleagues, Desiree and Juan, are going to be on the back end answering them. The images that you folks are going to see today, they were taken from the digital archives of the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Central Park Conservancy. And of course, our mission here at the Conservancy is to preserve and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of all. So welcome. All right, folks. So let's get started off with the basics. First of all, what exactly is Evacuation Day? Now, Evacuation Day isn't really the most popular holiday nowadays, but it was commonly celebrated here in New York City throughout the 1800s and into the early 20th century. Now, this holiday celebrated the British Army's retreat from Manhattan at the end of the Revolution. More specifically, it commemorates the moment when the British left New York Harbor in 1783. It's important for us to know that the entire island was occupied by British troops throughout most of the war, from 1776 until the very last year of the conflict. So the celebration was a significant one in the eyes of many patriotic New Yorkers. So as the story goes, the British were scheduled to depart the city on November 25th, 1783. But apparently still bitter over the defeat, there were a few rogue troops who apparently greased up the flagpole at the battery, making it difficult for the patriots to climb up and remove the Union Jack. However, a war veteran by the name of John Van Arsdale then heroically scaled up the flagpole just in time before the British left the harbor to replace the flag with the brand new stars and stripes. Now, whether or not this story is true is debatable. However, since then, Evacuation Day has been celebrated with patriotic parades and grand feasts with roasted meats and all kinds of delicious side dishes. It was actually the main public holiday celebrated by the city every year in November until Thanksgiving became more popular in the 1900s. So today we're going to take a look at how this formerly popular holiday was celebrated in Central Park throughout the decades. Now, before we proceed, I wanted to actually get a feel for how many of you have even heard of Evacuation Day before today. So I wanted to actually launch our poll early. And I wanted to see if you folks, there we go. So let's launch this poll right now. Okay, so pretty simple question for today. I myself didn't realize this holiday actually even existed until I got to college and heard about it in my history classes. But since then, I've always found this to be quite a fascinating relic of old New York. All right, so kind of looks like majority of us have taken part in the poll. So let's share these results and see what you folks have to say. All right, so it looks like, there we go. Not surprising, upwards of 78% of you have never heard of Evacuation Day before, whereas a minority, only about 22%, have actually heard of it before. So very, very interesting. And hopefully today we'll learn a little bit more about this old holiday that was once celebrated in New York City. So let's go ahead and move on, and let's start off with the map of the route today. So we're going to stay mostly up in the north end of the park, which contains the sites of numerous historic forts and batteries that date back to at least the Revolutionary period, starting from the Great Hill. And then we're going to work our way east towards the Harlem Mirror. Now, if you've been following us for a while, then these stops here on today's walk might look familiar to you, since I've actually done a few walks here before along this same exact route. But today I want to focus primarily on the 18th century. So we're going to start today from the Great Hill, which is located right off of the Central Park West entrance from 106th Street. Now, right at the summit of the Great Hill, of course, we have this nice flat grassy meadow surrounded by this very popular gravel path, very, very popular with joggers, runners throughout the year. And right at the center, we can see this very, very lovely red maple tree, which is actually at peak right now, or at least as of last week when I took these images. During the summertime, the Great Hill, of course, comes alive with the great jazz on the Great Hill, which brings in some of the top musical performers in the world for this free outdoor concert series. And the Great Hill, of course, has also had a very active history before Central Park. Now, during the American Revolution, the Great Hill was the site of a British military encampment that was occupied by German-speaking troops called Hessians. Here in the painting in front of us, we have an example of what one of these encampments in Manhattan Island might have looked like in the 18th century. The painting in front of us, by the way, doesn't actually show Central Park, but rather Inwood Hill, which also would have had its own Hessian encampment during the Revolution. But it does give you some idea of what the landscape here on the future Central Park might have looked like. And here's a map from the 1980s showing you that site of the British encampment right at the center of the Great Hill. In fact, when the park was being built up in the mid-19th century, Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted's work crews, they actually found artifacts buried in the ground, which dated back to the Revolutionary War era. So folks had known about this place as a Revolutionary War site since the very beginning of the park when it was first constructed. So let's continue on with our walk, and we're going to take this pathway here through the North Woods towards our next stop. And as we walk through the park, you can see just how much of autumn is, of course, still clinging on to life here in the north end. There's still very much a ton of leaf litter falling to the ground, at least, again, as of last week when I was walking through the park taking these images. And if we make our way around the corner, you'll see the historic blockhouse, which is one of the oldest structures in all of Central Park. Now, technically, the blockhouse was constructed for the War of 1812. So it's from about a generation after the events of the Revolutionary War itself. However, American troops created the structure in late 1814 over the site of an abandoned British redoubt that dated back to the Revolution. In fact, in older images of the park, the area around the blockhouse was known as the Old Bastion. And you can see the date, 1776, right down here at the bottom left on this lithograph from the mid-19th century. The date, of course, references the area's historic ties to the Revolution. Okay, and we're going to continue on now, and we're going to take the main drive down towards the next stop, which will be Fort Fish. So let's continue down the pathway, down the drive. Then we'll enter through the pathway right here back onto the woods. Now, along the way, we get a sighting of one of Central Park's black squirrels. Now, New York City has a ton of these squirrels with dark fur. Sometimes you might also see them with a dark brown or perhaps a cinnamon-colored coat, as opposed to the more common lighter gray. Technically, all of these squirrels, they all belong to the eastern gray species. Now, scientists aren't too sure exactly how they evolved to have black fur, but it is theorized that it has to do with retaining body heat during the winter season. Either way, people love seeing them wander around the park. I know I definitely do. So up ahead, we can see the summit of the hill where Fort Fish once stood. Fort Fish, like all the other forts in Central Park, was constructed by American militia during the War of 1812. However, it was built on top of existing military forts that had been left abandoned by British troops a generation earlier. Again, by the time Vaux and Olmsted came into the picture, the fort was long gone, but they did name the hill after the former military post. These days, not much here exists that tells you that this was, in fact, a military site. However, we do see this nice little lovely white granite bench that was put up in 1929 in honor of the park official Andrew Haswell Green. Okay, and let's continue on down the path. And from here, we're going to start exploring the northern fort's landscape. And right across the drive, there's a hill known as the Mount, which these days actually serves as the site of the Conservancy's composting operations. Now, the Mount, as we've learned in previous walks, does have a lot of ties to Revolutionary War history. Now, during that conflict, this was the site of a rural pub or inn called McGowan's Tavern, also known as the Black Horse Tavern. It was owned by an early Harlem family called the McGowans, who operated it until the 1840s. Now, during the Battle of Harlem Heights in 1776, at a time when Manhattan was occupied by the British, the tavern served as a base of operations for the General Lord Cornwallis and his lieutenants. Now, today, there really aren't too many obvious signs of the Mount's historical past, but if you walk around the base of the hill, you might see portions of this very old stone wall carefully hidden behind quite a bit of overgrowth. The wall itself dates back to when the building was being used as a convent in the 1850s, so long after McGowan's Tavern had been sold off. By the late 1800s, city officials had built a much more updated pub and restaurant here for the use of park goers. Fittingly enough, they called this the McGowan's Tavern after the old building that once sat here. While it was one of the more popular restaurants in the park and it attracted tons of folks up here on the north end, the tavern unfortunately was closed down by 1915 and the city eventually demolished it. Okay, so let's move on now and we'll make our way up the hill known as Fort Clinton, and let's go see what we have going on there. Now, throughout most of its time here in the park, Fort Clinton served as an important vantage point. So first of all, it was used by British troops during the Revolutionary War, and then later on by American militia members in the War of 1812. Today, of course, it's used primarily by park visitors who want to take in these incredible views of Harlem and East Harlem all around us. Now, here's the view from early 1814. So very different without any of the tall skyscrapers and apartment buildings that now dominate the Manhattan landscape. But of course, back then, beautiful views weren't necessarily the top, were not on the top of folks' minds. New Yorkers wanted to use this hill strictly for military purposes. So the two cannons here date back to the Revolutionary War era. However, these were never actually fired from this exact spot. The two guns that we're looking at, they were originally aboard the HMS Hussar, which was a 28-gun frigate of the Royal Navy. The HMS Hussar then ran aground in the East River while on a supply run, and it sank in 1780. Interesting side note, by the way, for many years and many decades, there were actually rumors that the ship contained millions of dollars worth of treasure, but no one's been able to actually find anything too much of value, besides maybe things like these two cannons, which were donated to the park in 1865. But that, of course, has not stopped folks from trying. Honestly, I think there's just something ironic about these British cannons that were once aboard a British warship, now on display, celebrating American independence from Britain. Now, here's a plaque commemorating this area's importance during the Revolution, especially the role of nearby McGowan's Pass. I think it's a nice little reminder of how Central Park is very much a deeply layered historical landscape. And if we follow these steps, they'll lead us down to McGowan's Pass itself, which was named after the very same family that owned the nearby tavern. All right, so here we are at McGowan's Pass. Now, as I might have mentioned in previous walks, The past these days doesn't really give off too much of much of a historical vibe or anything like that. Basically, it looks like it could be anywhere in Central Park, but this location was a very strategically important one. For many years and many decades, there was once a roadway called the Kingsbridge Road that ran right where the pathway is today. So Kingsbridge Road was one of the few ways out of New York City via land, and it ran right through portions of Central Park. And since New York was quite the battleground during the war, McGowan's Pass naturally served as a place where troops on both sides passed through multiple times on their way to military engagements. Now, in late 1783, at the end of the war, British troops finally made their retreat out of Manhattan using McGowan's Pass. George Washington himself probably even passed through here on his triumphal march from his headquarters north of the city down to the Battery, where he was greeted by massive crowds who were all cheering for him. And that moment is, of course, depicted in countless famous paintings, such as this one. Now, it should also be noted that in the end, in addition to the British Army, there were more than 29,000 Loyalist refugees who also departed New York in those weeks, including around 3,000 Black Loyalists and formerly enslaved folks who were promised freedom in exchange for fighting for the crown. Many ended up in Nova Scotia, up in Canada, and they actually found settlements there, including George Washington's own slave, Harry Washington, who had actually escaped from Mount Vernon in 1776 and then went on to fight for the British Army as a corporal. Now, over the years, generations of New Yorkers have been celebrating the British evacuation with things like parades and other patriotic displays. So grand banquets and dinners were also another popular way to celebrate. The top restaurants at that time all had very special menus made for Evacuation Day. And usually they would be like these very large multi-course affairs hosted by patriotic organizations, including a group called the Old Guard of New York. So the menu here on the left, this is from Delmonico's, while the one on the right-hand side, this comes to us from the Plaza Hotel. What's really interesting to me about the menu from the Plaza is how it features dishes like roast turkey, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, pumpkin pie, all of which are foods that we might associate with the holiday season. Now, by the early 20th century, Evacuation Day began to fall out of fashion in favor of Thanksgiving, and New Yorkers have since largely forgotten about it. However, its influences on Central Park and the city still remain all around us to this very day. In fact, many of the park statues were actually unveiled during Evacuation Day celebrations throughout the 19th century. So take, for instance, the statue of William Shakespeare over at Literary Walk in the Mall. This was actually unveiled in November 25th of 1866, so just 1 year after the end of the Civil War. So folks were in quite a celebratory mood at that point in time. The statue that we're looking at, by the way, this was sculpted by John Quincy Adams Ward, who also created the very well-known statue of George Washington down in Wall Street, commemorating, yep, you guessed it, the evacuation of the British from New York City in 1783. So the impact of this one historical moment from the Revolution is still very much strong into the present day. In fact, if you go to the Battery, the plaza where the charging bull is, today that's now known as Evacuation Day Plaza. All right, folks, so we're going to end things off right here with this nice, lovely picture of the statue of William Shakespeare. Now, later on in the month, we do actually have our Winter Wonderland tour coming up, so please do check that out. We're going to showcase the park's world-famous winter and holiday ambiance. So it is very much a nice, perfect little event or something to do if you folks have any friends or relatives visiting New York for the holidays. So please check that out in the chat. We'll post the link down there. So please do check that out. Again, if you like this weekly walk, you can also follow us on our social media platforms, including Facebook and Instagram. Again, I thank you all so much for your time. Now, from all of us here at the Central Park Conservancy, stay safe and be well. Have a good day, folks.